So thank you very much. Congratulations to Philip on his book. I agree that reform of the American public sector is a really key priority right now. And I basically agree with the basic proposal, which I would state in a slightly different form than he does, perhaps. There are too many rules in the way that we govern the country. Those rules need to be replaced by what he calls common sense. That is to say, government officials need to use their own human judgment to make various complex trade-offs and not try to do it through a prior ex-ante specification of outcomes. And at the same time, you need a system of greater accountability. Now, what he's basically talking about is increasing the amount of administrative discretion in American government in the executive branch. Now, if you use the word administrative discretion rather than common sense, all of a sudden that becomes pretty controversial, and in particular, a lot of conservatives will get their backs up. But I think we have to understand that that's essentially what it means. This has been done in other countries. So, for example, under new public management in the 1990s, a lot of Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, essentially made that trade-off. So, for example, the central bank governor in Australia has a contract. It sets performance criteria like what the maximum inflation rate is, and if he hits that, he gets renewed, and if he doesn't, he doesn't get renewed. But the contract doesn't specify in any detail how you're supposed to get to those objectives. And I think there's basically, a lot of empirical literature at this point. Daniel Carpenter, Peter Evans, Daniel Honig, that suggests that actually a sufficient degree of bureaucratic autonomy is actually the key to a high-performing public sector. So the basic proposal, I think, is absolutely right. However, I would make several caveats to that generalization, which then make it much more harder to apply in an American context. First caveat has to do with state capacity. A grant of autonomy to an executive branch agency is only possible, I think, under conditions of high capacity. If you provide more autonomy to low capacity bureaucrats, that is to say, people with poor training and background, I think what you're going to get is more incompetence and basically more corruption. I would say, by contrast, high-performing bureaucracies in the American government already exercise a lot of autonomy. So you think about, what are the high-capacity agencies, things like the Centers for Disease Control, NASA, the military, the U.S. military at an operations level, the staff of the Federal Reserve. These are, for the most part, staffed by PhD, level people. Congress doesn't attempt to give them any kind of detailed instructions on how to, set interest rates or put a man on the moon or conduct a complex military operation. And so they, in fact, have a lot of autonomy. The problem lies in lower level, and especially the kind of street level bureaucrats that don't have the training and education. And there, I think, autonomy becomes, quite problematic. So you consider, would you want a poorly, educated TSA person to make discretionary judgments on who looks like a terrorist, as opposed to the system in Israel where they train people to, at a very high level to try to detect who is a suspicious person coming through their airports. All right, so this grant of autonomy really does depend on having the right personnel to execute it. Second larger problem I've got is I don't like this bureaucracy versus democracy because the valence is wrong. I mean, it puts all of the blame on the bureaucrats themselves. In my opinion, the bureaucratic problems in our country are almost entirely the fault of Congress and by extension of the American people themselves. One of the most enduring characteristics of American political culture is distrust of executive authority. I think we carry this to a pathological level, And it leads us into a low-level equilibrium where we distrust the bureaucracy, therefore we don't want to fund it properly, and we don't want to give it sufficient authority. And that, somehow leads to poor performance. And then people say, oh, look, the bureaucracy isn't doing well. Why should we give it more authority and more resources? If you contrast that to countries like, let's say, Britain or France or Germany or Japan that have very high-quality bureaucracies, they're in a high-level equilibrium in which they grant, bureaucracies sufficient authority and resources. They do well, and people say, yeah, that's good. The government is really is really competent. I think another problem, that lies on the congressional Democratic side rather than the bureaucratic side, has to do with the mandates that create bureaucracies, and that's where I think a lot of the rules come from. Congress simply issues very poor mandates when they create federal agencies. They're often excessively complex, and they are contradictory oftentimes. You take the example of Dodd-Frank. The bill itself is hundreds of pages long, and then the enabling legislation, it's not the bureaucrats that wanted to do that. That's in the statute itself that mandated that the bureaucrats continue to write further rules. The reason is Congress basically doesn't want to either grant sufficient authority so that they don't have to write the rules because they don't trust, the outcomes, or they hope that if there are problems, it'll all be sorted out later by the courts. I think that the public sector, any kind of real reform along the lines that Philip is suggesting, is hindered by the basic problem of public distrust of bureaucrats and bureaucracies. And this, it's not even 8 o'clock in the morning, so I wasn't on for the first panel. But Paul Light, has written, especially his most recent book, extensively about this. We don't trust bureaucrats, therefore we put a cap on the total number of federal bureaucrats that actually was set back in the 1960s. So we don't have, many more bureaucrats than we did back then. Meanwhile, the size of the amount of resources funneled through the bureaucracy is increased by 5-fold, and we deal with that by outsourcing, by hiring contractors. I think that, this is really the result of a political culture that just doesn't, it wants to pretend that we're putting caps on government when all we're doing is capping our own ability to do the functions of government. I think that what Phil calls correctness is also characteristic of the American people themselves. If you have a polarized situation in which the two parties are looking for political ammunition against one another, you're going to call out the government on very small issues that really should, be allowed to slide because, sometimes people make mistakes. But that's a problem. That's the problem in military procurement. For example, the Federal Acquisitions Regulation want to make sure that, every single contingency is covered because you don't want a scandal in procurement, and that doesn't happen in the private sector. I will conclude just by the following. I'm not sure that we can fix the problem right now because of polarization. I just don't think the conditions are right for a big public sector reform because there is too much underlying, the political level is not, there's not consensus. So, Phil, for example, Philip talks about seeking the common good. It's kind of like the old progressive era mantra that we need, impersonal expertise that can look at public interest. But right now, I don't think we agree on what public interest is. If you look at environmental regulation, there are lobbyists on both sides that will tell you where that trade-off between economic growth and environmental protection ought to be, and there's simply not, a clear point at which a disinterested public official would have the authority to make that kind of judgment. So my 8 minutes are up, so thanks very much.